Hey folks, we're talking about Keystone units or hero units today, but before I get into that, I would like to remind you all that I stream on Mondays, EPT North America, 7:30 Eastern. I got a class before then now. Every Saturday evening, Sunday morning, EPT Korea, and other things as they happen. So make sure to check out my Twitch, twitch.tv/BamMilf. And of course, if you agree with what I said here, don't agree with what I said here, please leave a comment. Sub if you want to. Do all those fun things. Frost Giant is committed to making the next-gen RTS, not just StarCraft 3. This means that they are taking ideas from several RTS games, and one of the most controversial of those is the inclusion of hero units. Several interviews, say Winters or Harstams, for example, are really awesome ones. Link is in the below for both of those. Have Kevin Solid Monk Dong and other lead devs extolling the virtues of this idea of a limited hero unit, something like the Khan unit in AoE 4. And for those of you that aren't familiar, the Khan is the only hero unit in AoE 4. Only one that exists, and it plays for the Mongols. In their implementation, only one Khan exists. Can exist for each Mongol player, of course. It can only be on the map at any given time, and a dead Khan respawns automatically after some amount of time, unlike, say, the Mothership Core, which you had to rebuild and you had to rebuy. However, in contrast to the oft-maligned Mothership Core of the first StarCraft 2 expansions, and briefly in Legacy, the Khan directly buffs units, friendly units, instead of turning structures into units. This means that a player needs to commit supply to a location that the hero unit is making themselves useful, instead of building structures there and having far less of that resource committed. In general, Frost Giant's proposal is for less impactful hero units that provide flavor and army specialization without forcing the force concentration that the Mothership Core created with the spells that they were, and how you didn't have to spread your army out nearly as much because of those structures. It's interesting as the topic of hero units is, though, I want to talk about a bit broader of a subject. This concept of units that approach hero unit status, of what I'll call Keystone units. These are units that dominate whatever game state they are in. Good examples from StarCraft 2 are the Queen, the Raven, and the Oracle in like the early to mid game, and then something like the Viper in the late game, or perhaps the Raven too, if we're talking about TVT, and maybe goes to a lesser extent, although you build enough of them that I'm not sure we can make that argument. They are by far the most important units in their game state, and therefore they force the game to flow around their presence and their positioning. If we are properly discuss these Keystone units, though, we need to briefly have a discussion on what I'm going to call unit archetypes. To my mind, there are about 3 key roles that any unit in an RTS game fills. An offensive, a defensive, or a utility role. Offensive units, I mean, this is somewhat obvious, but are the most effective when generating agency on the map. When they're on their opponent's side of the map, when they're being aggressive, when they're forcing their opponent to react to them. Banelings are a great example. They're not all that great defensively, but you start them rolling in, the turn has to split backwards, it becomes a problem. Or the Protoss, whatever. They have a higher than average damage output, but they tend to be pretty glass cannon. Marines, similar. And tend to take more damage or have less health to balance them out in some way. Defensive units are the opposite. They benefit much more from positioning and having their opponents attack into them. Siege tanks were like the archetypical example here. You get them sieged up, they're really powerful. If they're not sieged up, they're not where they need to be. They don't get anything done. And then utility units don't really do either. They don't directly do damage, or if they do, it's with some drawback, such as a significant cooldown or requiring a lot of energy. For example, say High Templars and Storms, and then High Templars are a great example of what to do because they are only damage utility for the most part. But they change the game state to allow other units to be more effective. Vipers are kind of that archetypical support unit. They don't do any damage, but they deny damage from the opponent, and they can reposition things. Incredibly powerful, but limited. They don't work, they don't do anything if there's no actual army there to support them. Of course, most units embody components of several archetypes in their design. Marines Phil are both the offensive and defensive archetype. Pretty well for both, maybe a little bit more offensively. Battle cruisers are powerful offensive units that have this utility, Yamato, the ability to remove something from the map effectively, but more importantly, this teleport utility that allows them to, say, be both offensive and defensive beyond multiple spots of the map at any given time, almost. The elephant in the room, however, is the Queen. It's a unit that simultaneously accomplishes the defensive and utility roles to near perfection for the Zerg race. The other key concept I want to talk about or want to define here is this of gameplay convergence. There are factors in any RTS that funnel the choices a player can make, constricting their successful gameplay options until very few remain. Some of these are overall design decisions. StarCraft 2's Legacy of the Void reduced the amount of minerals per base and set it so that half the mineral patches would mine out faster. This necessitated quicker expansion patterns than Heart of the Swarm, than Wings of Liberty. But others are maybe, say, faction-specific. Protoss production is far more efficient once Warpgate is complete compared to before. So Protoss, 99 games out of 100, unless you're King Cobra, say, going for a Skytoss rush without anything. That means that most Protoss gameplay decisions in the early game revolve around getting a reasonably timed Warpgate, or if you delay it for a very specific reason. So I will reference the Queen, a good deal for the rest of this video, but that's not to say, wow, the Queen is a terrible unit, to malign the Queen. Rather, it's to look at what is arguably one of the most important units in StarCraft 2 and look at what we can learn from it as we move into Stormgate and, yeah, how that may apply. More than any other unit in StarCraft, the Queen fills two archetypes fully. It provides insane utility and incredible defensive strength. No other unit really fills these boxes equally well. As we'll talk about in a second, the Raven used to, but that's been nerfed out. Marines can defend well, but low HP, and they struggle when they are backed against the wall, when they can no longer kite. Siege tanks can be aggressive, but they do that so from a defensive setup. They have to siege themselves up and have things around them and play around structures very well. This means that while these units can dominate in certain game states, they're not the only important units in that game state. Colossus is an incredibly powerful defensive unit that can wipe out entire armies, but it needs these utility units. It needs force fields. It needs sentries. And these offensive units, Zealots, say, for example, that allow it to operate within a fight. Problems start to exist when units, and particularly Keystone units, fully fulfill multiple archetypes, or at least get close to doing so. From the launch of StarCraft 2 until 2017, the utility unit, the Raven, its kit was by far the most egregious version of this overlap. At the time, it had 3 spells. It had a point defense drone, it had a seeker missile, and it had an auto turret. The point defense drone would remove all enemy projectiles within the range of it, within 8 range, at the cost of energy. The seeker missile would do significant splash damage after a brief delay, and while also reducing the armor of the things that it impacted. And then, of course, the auto turret, much like we have in StarCraft right now, would deploy a turret that lasted for a limited amount of time, but would do significant DPS until it would eventually get killed or self-destructed. If we talk about this from the perspective of offensive, defensive utility archetypes, the PDD was this strong, incredible utility, defensive utility setup, but we can't even call it defensive because you could deploy it pretty much anywhere on the map easily. It would just maybe defend a space. It prevented really any fight within that area within it dominated, especially when it was spammed. And as we'll talk about, Ravens were spammed units, so you could get a lot of PDDs out. The Seeker Missile was this excellent utility spell that reduced armor that also deleted armies when it was cast, because that's just how splash damage works in StarCraft, and it would be used against air units, which clump up naturally. So 1 or 2 was fine, but you would cast 5 of them, and then the army had to either run away or explode. There was very little counterplay. And then the auto turret provided this incredible aggressive harass potential. You drop it in a mineral line, force a lot of APM, much like we see right now, and it would annihilate workers if left unchecked. As a result of how well-rounded the Terran or the Raven kit was, every Terran game would revolve around the unit. Whether getting a couple early game to dominate that, especially in TVT, TVP matchups, kind of like we see now, but to a much lesser extent, or massed in the late game, really in every matchup. Maybe less so against Protoss. The Queen for Zerg does a similar thing. It's the only reliable early game anti-air option that the race has. It provides an incredible utility heal, and not as strong as it once was. It's been nerfed, but even still, it's incredibly strong, and provides significant map control through creep spread, as well as gives the ability, the utility for the Zerg player to produce far more out of his hatcheries than the base hatchery production rate. While the Queen is lacking in aggressive potential, so it's only 2 of the 3, defensive and utility. I mean, we're going to ignore the Queen Walk meta. That was brief and nerfed out. It's no longer in the game. Its strength in the other 2 roles has led to a gameplay, or certainly an early game convergence, where Queens are often the only early game fighting units produced in the early to mid game for Zerg. 9 Queen, 11 Queen styles have certainly become more popular because you don't need anything else. It's beefy, it does some amount of damage, and you can heal it up to infinity. Units being stronger at certain times or dominating certain game stages are not inherently a bad thing or bad game design. The problem begins when that comparative strength leads to stylistic convergence. If there is strictly one best way to play the game, say massing queens early, massing ravens at the exclusion of all else in the late game, or ghosts, to take an example from Terrans in the modern TVZ style, that diminishes from the quality of gameplay. Both to play and to watch. It's not fun to just do one thing over and over again and only build one unit. You want that complexity. It increases the difficulty, increases the skill ceiling, and it's just more fun. Hero units will be Keystone units by definition. So this means that Stormgate will have to be careful to ensure that each hero unit excels at most one role. Maybe some secondary utility, but one role at most. Utility units should not do oppressive damage, say Seeker missiles, unless their utility is damaged. High Templars, for example, they do that very well. Strong defensive heroes should not enable strong offensive play to the extent that, say, the Mothership Core did with how incredible that Time Warp was, or Proxy Pylon Rush, or Pylon Overcharge Rushes, things like that. Frost Giants devs have been vocal about wanting to provide heroes as force multipliers rather than forces themselves, increasing maybe applying an AoE stim to a Terran analogous unit or something. But it's important to ensure that they relatively silo their abilities. I think we can all agree that we don't want to go back to that Raven meta.